Hi and welcome to the Journalism Salute. I'm Mark Simon. In each episode, we'll talk to or about an interesting person or organization related to journalism. The intent is to show that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Thank you for listening. On today's show, we're joined by Carrington Tatum. Carrington is a reporter for MLK50, a nonprofit newsroom focused on poverty, power, and public policy that was founded in 2017 by journalist Wendy Thomas. He's also a part of the Report for America program. Regular listeners know that we're a huge fan of that organization, which is now taking applicants for its next reporting class. More on that later. Carrington, hi, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
On November 30th, Carrington won the Breaking Barriers Award from the Independent News Network for a nearly 40-story series on the Byhalia Pipeline project, one slated to run through one of Memphis's poorest neighborhoods, only to be eventually dropped after months of protest by community and dogged journalism by MLK50. Before we get to that, Carrington, tell us the story of your journalism path.
It's a little weird one. I did not grow up wanting to be a journalist. Never considered it as a career option, but my doting mother made me go to college, Texas State University. I initially showed up for business, quickly learned that was not fun. So I took a semester, had some extra room for electives in my degree plan. And, I signed up for it. I kind of said, I'm going to punt business. I'm going to just figure out what I want to do. I signed up for a philosophy class, a psychology class, and a mass communications class. And I went in just open-minded, wanting to try each of these things that I kind of had a slight interest in. I had a really great intro to mass comm professor, Dr. Lori Fluker, and she was inspiring in more ways than one, but she sort of walked us through all these different areas of media. And she got to the journalist section and kind of explains the mission of being the fourth estate. That was the first time I was exposed to that idea. And at the same time, I had began working at the student newspaper, the University Star. I began writing opinion columns, which was the way I arrived at the Star was I needed a job. I needed to make money. I had always been a good writer, never liked doing it. And it seemed great to get paid to write. I felt like it was something I could do, so I did it. And between this intro to mass comm course, learning about what journalists do, and being in the newsroom and seeing the student reporters do their work, I always say I kind of caught the journalism bug. I was like, I think that's something I can do. And I think I can do it in my own way. And so from there, I ended up being the editor-in-chief of the University Star, went from there to the Texas Tribune, from the Texas Tribune to the Dallas Morning News shortly. And I say that was a weird turn because by then we had a pandemic hit. And I initially thought I would leave the Texas Tribune to join the Washington Post as an intern for them. But when the pandemic hit, they canceled the program. But I was really lucky that I had some people looking out for me. The Dallas Morning News, they picked me up, hung out there for a while, and then eventually ran into Report for America. And a recruiter, still trying to sort out, very early in the pandemic, so nobody knew what was going on. They asked, hey, did you want to, or have you ever heard of this place called MLK50 out in Memphis? And I sort of interrupted the recruiter. I was like, you don't need to tell me more. You don't have to sell me. I'm already a fan of MLK50. Put my name in. I want to work there. And that's what brought me here.
That's great. That's a fascinating way to go from no interest to this position. Now, I want to get to your upbringing and just how did what happened in your upbringing inform your journalism interests?
Yeah, that is a tricky question that I think often about, because while I never had an interest in journalism or knew much about it, I think there were qualities that I always had that would have made me a good journalist. Namely, I talk too much. I'm always asking questions. As a kid, that's what I was in trouble for, was talking, being far too curious, asking questions that were beyond my I guess what probably may or may not have been appropriate for whatever my age was. But I always loved to learn. Like, learning new things was always exciting. It didn't necessarily have to be something I was passionate about. It was just fascinating to learn something new. And I'm originally from Garland, Texas, which is a city right outside of Dallas, with about a third of the population of Memphis. And just growing up, I was also raised by a single mother, and she spent a lot of her time not only taking care of me, but she also spent a lot of time helping others. And I was also raised in church. And so, at a very young age, I was doing service, whether that was volunteering at the Salvation Army. Like, service was just a core part of my household. And so I think it was, when I discovered, I almost feel like a lot of things overlapped in a Venn diagram to bring me to journalism, whether that's learning about it on accident at Texas State, but also having these personal qualities, this background. I think it all kind of mixed together to bring me to a form of journalism that is deeply rooted in public service.
I liked how you said that when you heard the word MLK50, you were like, I'm already a fan. Sign me up. Totally interested. For those that aren't familiar with what it is, tell us about MLK50.
Yeah, that was what fascinated me. And when I say I was a fan of MLK50, this idea of doing justice through journalism was, as I developed as a reporter, as I learned more about the field, it was sort of an inkling of an idea of, in my own head of, I think there's a different way we could do our reporting that would, let's double down on helping people and serving the communities who need that help most. And I thought that was, as a very young reporter, as a student, I thought that was a far off idea that I would have to, attempt to do, a 30-year veteran in the game. But I stumbled on MLK50 just randomly one day, I think in search of, wondering if anybody had ever approached journalism this way. And I began reading the stuff, had never been to Memphis, so there was a lot of context I didn't have, but reading some of Wendy's early, it was a form of journalism that, really was, in my head, it was a dream, but at MLK50, it was a reality. And, I think it's an ongoing experiment, and that, obviously so honored to be able to contribute a little bit to that. And so when the recruiter called me, he didn't have to, tell me what the newsroom was. And I was able to tell him to put my name in. I got to work here. And when we talk about what MLK50 is, we're a nonprofit newsroom based in Memphis, focused on poverty, power, and policy. And we're actually a really small staff as well. So very young, as you mentioned. And like I said, I see MLK50 as an experiment where we are actively testing that thesis of what does it mean to do justice through journalism.
On your LinkedIn page, it says that the news should serve people who have been made most vulnerable by systems of oppression first. And I want to get to Byhalia second related to that. But what's an early example from your career of trying to live up to doing that?
When I think about reporting serving people who've been made most vulnerable, which is, to me, these are ideals, these are sort of goals that I set for myself, but, in many ways it's easier said than done, right? And I think early in my career, I experimented with that, even at the Texas Tribune, where as a reporting fellow, I covered homelessness. And specifically at that time, there were discussions from Governor Greg Abbott, who had, gone back and forth with some officials for the city of Austin about, policy around people who are experiencing homelessness. And obviously at the Tribune, focused on politics and policy. There were many stories that we needed to write, but the most important, I think, was the one where we simply went out to, people who were experiencing homelessness, living under the highways, waiting in line outside of shelters, and simply asked them, hey, how do you feel about this new policy? How do you feel about the things being said? The way people are viewing folks who are in your position, who are having this experience and who are unhoused. And with that story, it was really important for me because it was pulling those folks into a conversation that they otherwise would not be invited to. And there are also folks who have far less power than the people who are making decisions about, their livelihoods, right? And so to me, I think that's an early example of, leaning into that mission and saying, who are the people here who are getting the short end of the stick when it comes to how we set up society? Who are the people with the least power? who stands to harm the most by any of our policy decisions on this issue. And it would be the folks who are at the center of it, who are unhoused.
Giving a voice to those who are impacted. That's been a theme of people that we've talked to on this podcast throughout the past year and a half. With that, I want to get to the story, the story of this pipeline coming to Memphis, because it's a lot of story. Congratulations on the award. Yeah, give us an overview first of what the heck this story was and how it kind of came to be and what happened.
Well, yeah, you would think after 40 stories, I would be really great at giving a synopsis, but I think it's the opposite. So essentially, two companies based in Texas, they proposed a plan to build a crude oil pipeline that would stretch from the Valero Memphis refinery, which is in South Memphis, go from there to a facility in Marshall County, Mississippi. And that stretch of pipeline would run down through South Memphis and across northern Mississippi. When you're talking about South Memphis, you're talking about predominantly Black, low-income area, as well as an area that already has a disproportionate burden of pollution and polluting facilities. And so given that context and the company wanting to build their pipeline, there were folks in a small community, small neighborhood in Southwest Memphis called Boxtown. And folks in Boxtown, they had kind of stood up and, gone to meetings with the company, held their own community meetings through the neighborhood associations to essentially say, hey, we don't want this pipeline. We don't stand to gain anything. There's already too much pollution. So we don't want the pipeline. Don't build it. And from there, that grew and grew and grew to a national spotlight, in that you had all of Memphis, or people from all across Memphis, eventually jump in to block this crude oil pipeline that they say, many critics say the pipeline was an example of environmental racism, of, placing fossil fuel infrastructure in communities with the least economic and political power to fight it.
We've done a number of stories on environmental racism, or talked to a number of people covering environmental racism, dating back to the first episode of this podcast when we discussed tree cutting in Seattle, something that's prevalent East Coast to West Coast. What was the hardest part of trying to cover this?
The hardest part, I think, was simply the reach of this issue. And that's why I say as a reporter, it's difficult for me to provide this succinct synopsis, because this pipeline, which, has millions of dollars going into building it, or even, simply doing the preparations to propose the idea, you're reaching across several branches of government, stretching across a whole bunch of landowners' property. And so for me, it was getting up to speed on, being able to watch this issue at city council, at the county commission, in the courts. It was such a broad issue with a far reach, and it had so many corners, feeling like I had to get to them all as I think that is a reporter instinct of wanting to do every story possible and leave no stone unturned.
And you got to 40 of them. If you were to give advice off of what you learned from the experience that you just said to someone, a future potential Report for America reporter, related to what you just said, what would the advice be?
My advice would be, one, to talk to any and everybody, just as a fundamental rule. But I think it's really important to find the experts in these different fields, rather than trying to, because it becomes a point to where you cannot become, sort of the master of all of these different spaces. You need other people's expertise to lean on. And it's really helpful that if you already have that network of, whether it's attorneys who can explain what these court documents mean, whether it's, sources who understand the inner workings of the city, who can explain, what permits mean, and even scientists who can explain the chemicals and the mechanics that go into, constructing a pipeline. Yeah.
What was your experience in trying to tell the story from Plains Pipeline's perspective?
All of my reporting, the cornerstone and the underlying fabric is providing a fair and accurate report of whatever's happening. And very early on, I had lots of conversations with representatives from Plains All-American Pipeline, one of the companies that was Plains All-American Pipeline partnered with Valero Energy Corporation to construct this pipeline. And I had a lot of conversations with them early on. And I think a part of that was, simply leading with my goal and my cornerstone of ethics being, fair and accurate. And, I think the challenge came in later in the reporting, and especially as the community's fight grew and picked up momentum. Eventually, representatives stopped taking my calls and stopped responding to my emails, which, to your point, that does make it difficult, because for me, it's always about being fair on an issue and being able to talk to all of the stakeholders, everybody involved, in the project, and get all of these perspectives to provide a well-rounded story, which is difficult. But I think they're also, as a reporter, the best tool I have to get someone's perspective is to bug the snot out of them. And I believe I did that. I gave my best effort to be persistent, and then just find, other resources, marketing they've posted online, things they've said before, to always try and put that in. Because to me, the best reporting, has to be well-rounded in that sense.
One thing that you noted in one of your pieces was that you combed the community pretty well, and you couldn't find anyone who was in favor of this. So in July, the project was canceled. First of all, what was that like, and what was your coverage of that like?
Yeah, so when they announced the cancellation, that word came on a Friday at the end of the day. In fact, my coworkers had, just posted in Slack saying, everyone have a great weekend. We'll see you later. And then that news came down, and I had to break the news to my colleagues that, hey, weekend might have to hold a little bit later, because pipeline, or the company, is abandoning the project. And in that moment, it was sort of that, I think every reporter knows, that adrenaline rush of breaking news, of needing to get that word out. And that's exactly what it was from my perspective. It was, making the calls to confirm that news, checking with folks in the community to get their responses. And I think that was sort of the first story we did was to announce that news, right? That the company was abandoning the project, but then also just talking to all of these folks who had been so heavily involved in the fight, to sort of get their reactions to it.
And there were a few different layers that were involved in the cancellation, and different things related to court and all these different things that you had to do. You wrote an op-ed, essentially a commentary about this. One of an excerpt from that: Plains representatives did not consider the option of not building a pipeline because the community doesn't want it, since fossil fuel companies historically have never been required to care what poor Black communities think of their business. What was it like writing that and writing that piece?
Yeah, my editor asked if, I wanted to write that piece. And I think it was, it's putting on a different hat, it's sort of stepping into a different set of shoes. But I think, having spent, so many months covering this fight, and really, the pipeline is an object itself. But I think for many folks in the community, they often told me that, it's not just about the pipeline, it's about a history of, having to carry the pollution, carry the burden, pay the price for, other companies to profit. And so given all that perspective, and even, watching that fight unfold, I think that was one way to kind of analyze the chain of events, is that, and all of the decisions that could have been made along the way, that was sort of the last option. And I think, if you do the historical analysis, because again, the pipeline wouldn't be the first piece of fossil fuel infrastructure in Southwest Memphis. There are a lot of facilities that, folks are taking issue with. Even Southwest Memphis, as often cited, there's a study that has found the cancer risk to be 4 times higher than the national average in that area. And so I think for many folks in the community, the pipeline was not the first thing. It was the latest in a long history of, those facilities being forced onto those communities, and in many cases, them not being able to stop it, and the company not being required to, or forced to, or having any pressure not to.
I feel like this is the part of the story, if I was watching, and I feel like I've seen movies of this nature, in which everyone in West Memphis celebrates and the company just moves on to the next community, and for them, the beat goes on. Have you seen this story play out anywhere else and seen any other communities have to deal with it?
When you say this, you mean environmental?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I mean, yeah, we're talking about environmental injustice. I think that is it's a broad subject that is getting more and more attention because it is sort of an ever-present force, and ever-present injustice in our communities. And so, to your point, the pipeline itself, the company has abandoned the project, but I think broadly, environmental injustice itself is certainly not gone away. I think that would be a difficult story to write, to say that.
Well, and you've done pieces like one that I saw on Black millennials for a Memphis-based environmental journal justice organization that advocates for the reduction of lead exposure. So this takes on many forms. What's the most interesting thing you've learned about the science of this in the time that you've done your report?
Man, yeah, I think that's probably the biggest learning curve, is learning the names of chemicals I never thought I'd need to know about. But I think what's fascinating to me is sort of the extent of, I guess, when we talk about pollution burden, when we talk about sort of these facilities, to me, it is interesting to see how deeply rooted, toxic facilities are, and sort of the pollutants, whether they be in the air, the land, the water, these things all kind of mix around to create, well, I guess what is difficult, we're talking about environmental injustice, and the environment is everything, right? And so I think there are always new layers to say, just right off the bat, even the idea that somehow the air can be a medium for racism, for discrimination, for that pollution to travel and be disproportionately concentrated on, low-income Black communities, right? Like, that right there is enough to shock some folks. But the more I learn, there's always a new corner of the environment that I learn injustice reaches to. So whether that's, lead in the homes, whether that is, the things that are in the soil, right? Like, there really is no limit, because in a weird way, everything's an environmental justice if you look at it with the right lens.
It's amazing. In the interviews that I've done, I came in knowing zero about that as a subject. And now in maybe half a dozen interviews that we've done over these 50-something interviews, it's come up. And every time I'm like, whoa, that's a completely different way of looking at it. I want to touch on a couple of other types of things that you've written about in your time with MLK50. And there's a pretty broad range here. You recently wrote about the killing of the rapper Young Dolph, a Memphis native, and explained how his lyrics connect with some of Martin Luther King's messages. You did a Q&A several months ago with a state politician who was facing federal charges. It was from what I could read, it seemed like a pretty intense Q&A, trying to get to the bottom of what she was being accused of and later convicted of, and what was going on with that case. What have the other things that you've covered been like to cover during this experience with Report for America?
It is tricky for me as a reporter, because I'm constantly, moving to all these different stories. But I think one thing that sticks with me is sort of the gravity of many of the stories I write, and particularly, poverty, power, and policy are not lighthearted issues. And so with any story I write, to me, my cornerstone is telling stories that focus on people's humanity, right? And because I think that is the difference between, you could write an environmental story focusing on the harm to trees, but you can also write a story focusing on the harm to people. Not to say that trees are not important, but even then, when we talk about why trees are important, it's because trees have, an impact, have an effect on humans, on the people that depend on trees in one way or another. right? And so to me, every story I write, I try to make sure I'm keeping humanity at the center. And, I think that makes for good reporting that serves the community, but it also does come with emotional toll. When you're talking about, the killing of a Memphis icon, of a great artist of our time, or even anyone's incarceration. Also, Purvis Payne, a man who was convicted of murder and sentenced to die, and also someone with an intellectual disability. And to me, the gravity of all these stories is something that sticks with me in a way that I'm actively having to learn to cope with as a reporter. From death to incarceration, neither of those things are, those are not outcomes that should be taken lightly.
Heartbeat journalism, I think, is what you might call it. With that in mind, what are your future career aspirations?
I don't know. I should have it figured out. I should have a 10-year, 50-year plan together.
Not necessarily.
Like some of my stellar colleagues, but that's not me. I am very much focused on the reporting that I'm doing right now. And, I'm still actively trying to figure out, what the next step looks like for me.
What are the benefits of the Report for America program?
Oh, well, Report for America, there's a long list you could give, but I think one of the things that's most important is Report for America gets you away from your home in many cases, right? So it puts you in an environment that is new, unfamiliar, makes you stretch yourself and grow to, be a great reporter in a new environment, which I think, is also helpful just in your personal capacity. And so I think if you are really interested in traveling, if you're interested in seeing new places or just finding a new environment to explore, Report for America is great for that. And also being able to bolster local news is a far different mission than, any other journalism job you could have, because I'm a big fan of local reporting, and I believe in, building the news from the ground up. And so to me, those are the two things that are really important to me, is knowing that I have a very specific mission that, supports my journalistic and personal values, but then also just being able to go into a new environment and have a network that's going to support you there.
What advice would you give to someone in doing the application?
I would advise them to be open-minded about the places you can go, because I think there are many places we know for certain that we'd like to be when we look at the list, and which newsrooms we know would be our favorite, would be our ideal. And there are some that we think we would never want to work in or never want to go to, but I think being open-minded is really important, because even coming to Memphis, it was not in my plan. I had not considered the idea, but I'm really glad I came, right? And I think this was the best outcome for me in more ways than one, but it wasn't something that was at the front of my mind. So I would just recommend to anybody applying, don't be afraid to stretch, challenge yourself, maybe try something you don't think you are unsure about.
All right, last question. Is there a journalist, one that you're maybe not affiliated with, journalist or journalism organization, that you would like to salute for their good work?
Man, there's a lot of people.
You can do more than one.
Okay, well, I will say shout out to Leanna First-Arai, who she is a great journalist who also understands, what it means to do justice through journalism. In fact, she wrote some of the first stories for MLK50 and Southerly on the Byhalia Pipeline. And it was actually those stories she wrote, the folks who came in to help bolster the fight a little bit later, they read her stories, and that inspired them to get more involved in the fight. So I think I would salute her, Adam Mahoney at Grist, covering environmental justice and doing a really great job of, like I said, putting that humanity at the center of environmental issues. But I will stop there, because I will go all day if you let me.
Carrington, Tatum, MLK50 Memphis, thank you for taking the time to join us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Report for America has applications open to join its program. There will be approximately 150 slots available across the country. There's an emphasis this year on reporting in rural areas, covering education, the environment, and communities of color. The program is also looking to fill 24 Spanish-speaking positions. Applications are being accepted until January 31st. However, those who apply before December 31st will receive early consideration. To learn more and to sign up for an information session, go to their website at reportforamerica.org. You can also check out the interviews we've done with Morgan Mullings, Cassidy Arena, and Farnoosh Amiri that are linked in the show notes. I want to tell you about another podcast that goes well with this one. Join Will Hitchcock and Siddha Vidyanathan on Democracy in Danger. Each week they interview brilliant guests who are helping them save government by the people, one episode at a time. Find Democracy in Danger wherever you get your podcasts or visit dindanger.org.
Welcome to Journalism History, a podcast that rips out the pages of your history books to re-examine the stories you thought you knew and the ones you were never told.
I'm Terry Finneman, and I research media coverage of women in politics.
And I'm Nick Hirschon, and I research the history of New York sports.
And I'm Ken Ward, and I research the journalism history of the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains. Find the Journalism History podcast at journalism-history.org/podcast and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.
Thank you for listening to the Journalism Salute. Please let us know what you think of the show. You can find us on Twitter at JournalismPod, and you can email us at journalismsalute@gmail.com.